Welcome everyone to our panel Futurism in Fantasy. My name is Sola. I am your moderator for today. We'll be exploring how imagined futures and fantastical elements intersect in storytelling. I am joined by four fantastic panelists: Joshua D. Martin, Robin LeeAnn, Sean Morrissey Carroll, Agoawike. I would let each of you briefly introduce yourself, your work, and how you connect with this topic.
Yes. Hello, I'm Joshua D. Martin. I come from the Peach State, Georgia, United States. I love science fiction, mixing it with fantasy in my own way. I always lean on futurism heavily, and I always love the retro futurism aspect too. So usually my works are like a love letter to 70s, 80s style of writing. I've been featured in my first, the first magazine I've been published in, Dark Horses, uh, Strange, Strange Sheep. I can't think of the name of the top of my head, but in that story, it was basically took place in a computer, but it is a fantasy world. That's probably the weirdest story I've ever written. And I have a story coming up soon in Lovecraftiana, which takes place on a generation sort of sea ship, and you'll see like fish zombies in there with a fantastical element. So I like to make really weird stuff.
Hi, I'm Sean Morrissey Carroll. I am a climate fiction author here in Houston, Texas, an editor with the Tomeworks Collective, and a community organizer. So definitely try and connect different writers, different groups in town as well.
Hi, I'm Robin LeeAnn. I am a writer and an editor. I run an editing business over at Dragon Editing Services, but I've also been a writer since crap, I was maybe 4 years old. I really dived into futurism actually lately with my current work in progress. I've been writing a solar punk novel recently. That's been really fun to see all the world building tips that like other people have done, and then kind of building it into my own. Been really fun.
Hi, I'm I'm an author of speculative fiction in general, which futurism does play a part in that. I recently published my debut novel, Blackest Diamond, in March this year. And in terms of like my other futurism works with futurism in them, I'm similarly working on a punk style like dash punk style project as Robin, but it's sandal punk, so it's we're going a little more ancient rather than futuristic with the futurism in this story.
Amazing. So, to ground us, let's start broad. When you hear futurism, what does it mean to you, especially in a storytelling context? Joshua, why don't you start us off?
Futurism, it really people really think of it from their perspective of the time they're living in, something that's technology that would maybe improve or maybe make their lives more scary from the point they're living in. But futurism can take place from any time point with a perspective of what that time period is going through with technology changing their lives. Because you have older type genres like diesel punk, steampunk. It may take place in an older time than us, but it still has a futurism aspect um, with the society or civilization being changed by technology. So to me, it just means like
Mm,
change, through a scientific lens.
that's very interesting. And Robin, do you have a different definitions?
I would say more fun, and I would say more playful too, because it's a blend of fantasy and sci-fi. But you really, when you have a lot of fantasy stories, the traditional is like medieval kings and medieval queens by candlelight kind of a thing. But so it's fun to actually maybe have like dragons with different types of technologies and things like that. Like you really allows you to have fun ways to branch out and find magic in different time periods. That we're not just stuck with this one technological side, that we can just explore the world.
Sean, do you also define it differently, or do you agree with what has been said so far?
Totally understand that it can be taken in several ways. Like I used to study art history, and so when I hear futurism, I think of those Italian artists, European artists from the 2010s as industrialization was happening. And you combine that with fantasy, and it feels like it kind of inverts what futurism in that original text meant. Because they were all about getting to the future, getting rid of the past, getting rid of cultural differences between people. This post humanism, this pan humanism. And in fantasy, I love that bringing different elements of where people's cultural relativism was and is a major element of it. Even though medieval is typically what a lot of people associate with fantasy, Asian, African, South American, there are so many different versions of fantasy worlds that are being written by authors and that can be dragged into the future.
And maybe for do you see futurism as prediction, speculation, or something a little bit more thematic?
I know there is a formal definition of futurism and it relates more to like visual arts, as far as I can tell. But for me, futurism, in fiction at least, I would have to say is stories that concern themselves with quote unquote futuristic ideas, technology, or like technology and ideas in places that you would normally find them in. So like, um, it kind of I kind of want to say like a anachronistic fantasy in a sense, but um, it wouldn't be necessarily anachronistic if you're not acknowledging that the out of place, more technological elements are out of place when you're just like thinking of them as natural to this like fantasy story. So that's futurism to me, at least.
I love that you mentioned this technological, and that is always mentioned in futurism fantasy, or like that's what we always think of when we hear the word futurism, right? Great. So when, like you mentioned, when we mention futurism, I believe oftentimes people will think of science fiction rather than fantasy, right? And there's often a lot of overlaps between the genres anyway. So where do you draw the line between futuristic fantasy and science fiction? And Robin, I will let you start us off this time.
My thought is it needs to at least have fantasy as a core element of the story. So it's still like a
Mm,
big part of what's going on in general. It's not just a lot of sci-fi and just like a small part of fantasy, but fantasy still plays like a big part of the story.
Maybe you can chime in if you, from your own expertise. Do you think that maybe from the perspective of readers, do you think that readers treat these two genres differently? Do you think that the same story maybe that can be read as both?
Thinking of my experience as a reader before I became an author, um, I kind of did, but kind of didn't, because a lot of, especially more nowadays, a lot of science fiction does take on science fantasy elements, fantastical elements, like those very liminal um, tropes that like could be that like if you've seen that Tumblr post where it's like if it's a cube it's sci-fi, if it's a orb it's fantasy, like just the general overlap of so many fantasy and sci-fi tropes that it's like very hard to distinguish the two, which is part of the reason why like some people including me think like, oh, genre is a little bit fake, so like you can't really differentiate the two. But I would have to say that there's definitely a difference between science fantasy, for example, and future and fantastic. Sorry, and how do I put this? Like futuristic fantasy, in the sense that science fantasy very much leans under the subgenre of science fiction, where I believe futuristic fantasy is more like very deeply enmeshed in fantasy, but there are a lot of elements of that like technology and like more not necessarily scientific, but like um, elements that you would find in stories that are not classically fantasy. Like maybe you will see a hologram in a fantasy story, but it's not a hologram. It's like a fantasy hologram. And that's something that I feel like differentiates the two, is through the lens in which it's written about in the story, where in that kind of thing, if you put it in a science fantasy, it would be purely technological, but in a futuristic fantasy, it's like a fantasy item, not a science like a science-based item.
I'm going to make a difference between two things, and I really, Solar, wonder what your opinion is on these, because hearing futuristic fiction, a futuristic fantasy, I'm making up my own definitions, but it also can be a analog for sci-fantasy. And sci-fantasy is kind of take a science fiction but make it very soft. You don't have to explain things. And futuristic fantasy to me means that you're bringing elements of the past way, past our time into the future and giving them some new technologies and stuff. So really, I think it can be taken both ways.
Do you, from your expertise then, do you think that readers necessarily treat them differently, or is it more on us as writers?
Would you say that sci fantasy is a subset, of this futuristic fantasy then? Very possibly. Because I do think that if you're doing soft science fiction, if you're not really explaining things, that definitely could be a future fantasy, because a sufficiently ahead of us technology is indistinguishable from magic. But I feel like the way that you've cast this idea of futuristic fantasy brings up the idea of using magical elements from other cultures from the past. And so when you're talking about things like bringing ghosts into the future, vampires into the future, the idea of different cultures surviving past the stage where we're at today, where part of the population wants to erase and say, oh, everybody's all the same, let's treat them all the same. And the idea of bringing those magical unexplainable elements into the future and what that is going to become.
And so, Joshua, do you think the same story can be read as both? Maybe?
As both futuristic fantasy and futurism.
Yes. Hmm.
In a way, yeah. Um, it depends. Because for me, I like to know where it ends, even in a universe I'm writing in, where maybe where the magic ends and the science goes, or maybe they mix together in a way. Because you can uh, write a story where you might make up an entire system, but you write it in a way where it feels more like a science than
Mm.
magic. Because when you're writing magic, if you want it to feel magical, you give it a sense of mystery and it acts on feelings or faith sometimes. While science, it really depends on you to pick it apart and for characters to discover different aspects of it. And that can live in the same world you're writing in, I suppose. Um, and I think they could coexist because you have universes like Marvel, DC, you have hard science characters or fantasy characters um, living interchangeably.
My next question, actually, I would like us to talk a little bit more about um, the this magical aspect of fantasy versus how you use that in a more futuristic or a more scientific setting. What do you think that some of the different ways that fantasy elements can exist in a futuristic world, and bring as many as anecdotes as you would like to, because I would love to hear more about this.
I think one of my favorite ones from a kid was the Infernal Devices series by Cassandra Clare. It has more of a steampunk type of technology, but there's a lot of angels and a lot of demons, and they have their own society and how they use magic versus just also, I think it's set in like 1600s London. So it has like the
Yep.
old Times River and everything like that as well. They also, in a very interesting way, and the way that we advance science, they advanced magic. So like they invented like the first portal during that series. So it was like kind of fun to see them doing like science on magic to advance their magic and to be able to get farther, which I thought was really cool.
This might be a not necessarily a controversial one, but like I know that other people might think differently, but I would just have to say like Saga, the graphic novel series, by Fiona Staples and Brian K. Vaughan. It's it's very much like a space opera saga, but there's so much fantasy and magic in it, especially from one of the two main adult characters that like I kind of have to think that it's like very much on the edge, veering a little more into like futuristic fantasy than purely sci-fi because they do travel through space, but they're in like a magical plant spaceship for a lot of the beginning. So it's like, where is the line? And like and like similarly on that note, with a little more science fiction influence is the comic Ava's Demon, which I mean it includes like fantasy demon characters. They're again, they are in space, but like the core plot is like this magic demon is inside the main character and she has to like deal with it. So it's like we're like
Wow.
the backdrop is very much science fiction, but the actual plot is dealing with like fantasy elements that you'll find in any other typical kind of fantasy story.
You mentioned something like sandalpunk, right? Can you explain what it is?
So Sandalpunk is one of the many punk genres that came out of Steam. I believe it was steampunk that was the first one, and it's basically how do I describe it? It's basically like sword and sandal, but with some technology aspect, like some like futuristic technology aspects, I believe. So it's like I'm trying to actually think of a good example. I would say, um, I think like Xena Warrior Princess, the TV show, would be Sandalpunk. Conan, not Conan, but oh dear. It's actually really hard to think of like good examples that like have the technology aspect that makes it sandalpunk and not just purely sword and sorcery, or
Mm,
sword and sandal. But yeah, it's a little bit like set in like classical, pre-classical eras with magic and technology. So anything I feel like there are some TV shows that are like slipping my mind, but like that have like this like very ancient setting, but have like this very strange, maybe it's alien technology, maybe it's like magical
mm,
technology, but like that element in it.
Yeah, I knew this was coming because I had a lot of examples. I'm
great.
pretty particular of how I write technology because I like it to exist almost independently from magic because that's what's satisfying for me. That, this isn't just, technology running on magic, but it's possible in real life. That's what I find it so cool in sci-fi that even if there's a little leeway of, writing and, it's fiction, it could possibly exist. But examples with, futurism being done right in fantasy, I think of Arcane, where,
Mm,
there's a lot of magic going
one
on,
of my
but
favorites.
yeah, Jace, he really goes through the scientific process of testing this strange element and implementing it into tech and how that changes his city. And I also think of Star Wars. It's a really controversial change when with the midichlorians that's supposed to be responsible for the connection to the Force. I always liked that. Maybe it's because I grew up with the prequel movies. Other people didn't like it because they thought it took
Mm,
away the mystery. But I love it because it adds a layer of, you could do blood tests for midichlorians to see who is probably more force sensitive. You can do experiments to try to force someone to be, force sensitive, creating, uh, horrible creatures that probably shouldn't be, that maybe goes against what the Force wants, if it wants anything. I always thought that was interesting.
growing up, let's say I really love Star Wars, obviously. And do you think that Star Wars is kind of more like space fantasy, or is that like too simple? Or do you have other let's say, examples on the distinction between futuristic fantasy versus science fiction, pure science fiction?
Star Wars is a funny pastiche because they take Zen robes and tell an American audience that this is what Jedi wear. But if you know anything about Zen Buddhism, you immediately recognize it. They take a Luger, a gun from Germany from World War II, and put a flashlight on top of it, and that's a blaster that shoots lasers now. So they're using elements of the past and bringing them forward, but I don't think that they were as evident, as explanatory, as you would need to be to call it futurist fantasy. When you have things like Arcane, I think that you do have direct parallels to the past. A great story that I relate to this is a novella by Alistair Reynolds called The Six Directions of Space, where he imagines that the Mongolian Empire went on to take over all of the Earth and then was the dominant culture that created space travel and went off into space. And so they're off near another planet on a space station, but everything's Mongolian. It's very different than what we want to whitewash in Americana and say, oh, this is how space will be. It has its single only flavor as Americana.
That's what makes like Star Wars is such a interesting and strange piece of media because it's like it is a space opera, it is science fiction, but like there is definitely like obviously fantasy elements in it to the point that some can and I think some have argued that it could be considered science fantasy. But I think the difference is that that one t science Star Wars posits and like presents itself as a purely science fictional piece of media. And even though the Force is a little more like fantastical, it's still explained through like a scientific lens, like I said earlier. Whereas in a science fantasy story, I believe it would be spoken of more as like actual magic, like a spark of white fire, which is by I believe it's by Sangu Mandana, I think. It's very that book is very much science fantasy, where it's like, yes, we are in space, but we are dealing with fantasy elements, and it's painted through the lens of fantasy.
I've always put Star Wars as more fantasy than sci-fi. Like I always seen the other side of it, just because there's just so much of it that's unexplained by just the hard computing science of it. But of course, I haven't watched all of it, so there is probably some science in it. But I think it really depends on like just the type of fantasy. Like they were saying with, is it a object that can be explained more by magic, or is the object of the technology more explained by um, technology and science and stuff like that?
And even in stories where like it's obviously a magic system, but in Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, they have to know what each element is until they can make something of it. It can only do what an element can do. They can just can't create new rules for metal to do uh for water to do. They can't make something up of a magical quality. It's just like telekinesis with extra steps, if I'm being honest. But they get to use cool magic circles to make it look fantastical.
I love that you bring up Fullmetal Alchemist. I do not know that many people know that anime, but I actually watched that growing up as well. And I think that, like you mentioned, there's some magical aspect to it, but there's a lot of scientific facts that they still need to abide while creating this magical system, right? And what about the others in the chat? Do you have other examples? Feel free to bring up. This is a great time for us to build our reading and watch lists. So feel free to jump in. Now that we're getting deep into we're getting our hands dirty into the making of a futuristic setting. What are some of the different ways that fantasy elements can exist in a futuristic world? And don't be afraid to bring your anecdotes into it, because would love to hear more about you and how you bring this together. How would you approach this, Robin?
With a lot of what if questions is usually my type of how I start. Um, because my what if question that I originally had started with is I've seen a lot of people want to say that we've like advanced enough as society that like it's so much easier than what it was even like 100 years ago, and we've gotten so much improvement with like women's right to vote and things like that. And they act like we're just done and that we don't really need to like go into green energy, or we don't need to like build a better world. Like the world is better. So it's, but I feel like just challenging it and saying, no, there's so much more that we could do. Even if the world feels a lot better, that there's still some that we can improve upon. That's how I started. And I had originally just thought about solar and because I have an electric car now and just going into that. And then the more I looked into it, because I was like scrolling on Pinterest and stuff like that, um, I had found the name solar punk. So that I just went down that kind of hobby lane of trying learning more about it. Um, but I had done it with magic in general. It's magic in general in the society. Bringing in different mythical creatures was another way to do it I've seen, is just having like either like a dragon or a phoenix, but think like modern day setting or like in a steampunk setting. What would the dragon be made of? That type of steampunk material and that type of technology? Or like how would magic even coexist with all these technology? As technology advances, does magic just become mediocre and no one really cares about it? Or is there some people who break apart or like, no, we're on the magic side, or people are like, no, we're on the technology side? Like there's so many different ways you can just daydream about it and come across so many fun ways to introduce fantasy and sci-fi. I feel like it's just like whatever you want is whatever you get.
Yeah, like 100%. I believe like you can, I mean, you can do anything with fiction that you want, but like magic and technology together is definitely one of my favorite things to like write about in particular. Because I feel that sometimes when people think of fantasy, they think of like, I mean, yeah, like not sometimes, just a lot of times, like the average layperson will think of fantasy as like a purely archaic, purely in the past, very much like medieval or like pre-medieval type of thing. But what I love about writing futuristic fantasy is that I get to sort of like um disabuse those notions like, yeah, but like what if there were cars, or what if there was like a magnetic levitating train in the middle of this fantasy world? Like what about that? And my favorite thing to do is like not necessarily address it, but like have like try to convince the reader like you're already suspending your disbelief for the magic. Maybe suspend your disbelief a little more for the fact that these people have also been able to discover that they can make electromagnets with these kinds of materials they have in their world. And one of the things that I really think uh and that's part of the reason that I like solar punk, as Robin mentioned, steampunk, sandalpunk, as I said earlier, is that these subgenres really mesh the ideas of fantasy and science fiction together, and by blend like forcing you to consider the ways in which these more like ancient periods, older periods can include futuristic technology, can include more advanced technology than today, and also bringing up what Robin mentioned about like the ways people think thought in the past, and the ways like we have it better now, but also worse in some ways. That's something I also really like to consider, is the ways that like futuristic thought comes into play in these stories, not just like a futuristic setting. Like, what if, yeah, the world is it's like set in a like Imperial Rome inspired era, but they have the way that they think is a little more futuristic, a little more like in line with how we think today. Not necessarily historical fiction, because that is a different matter, I believe, but like something like Sophie Burnham's Sargassa, which is, I believe, set in Imperial Rome, but it does have what I would consider like futurism inspired thinking, futurism inspired like ideologies in the story. And I just really believe that the way to use science fiction, sorry, fantasy in a futuristic setting is kind of just like do whatever you want and try not to explain it too much because the magic of the fantasy, those fantasy aspects comes from the sort of the going with the flow aspect because it is at the end of the day magic, not technology that you're trying to put into the story. And if it's explained like technology, it sort of does lose that magic a little bit.
I do think that Jade City by Fonda Lee is a great example of where there's magic, but it's tech. And also, it's very much of just a different cultural viewpoint of the future rather than, the Isaac Asimov kind of blankness of the future. I Catabasis by R.F. Kuang, and Echopraxia by Peter Watts are another couple of fun ways to look at it's the future, we're in space or we're on Earth, but technology has advanced, but there are still mysterious elements that are magical or that are unexplainable. And that's an element of our past as humans. That's where myths and folklore comes from, is the unexplainable.
And while we're on the eh, topic of examples, and I would love to bring this back to you guys and your work. Maybe if you're comfortable with, why don't we talk a little bit more about your own writing and how you personally have combined futurism and fantasy in your story?
I guess my example would be the corpse of the Doku the Maid, the story that's in the magazine on the left of me, right of me,
Mhm.
where I have it in it's a technical sci-fi setting, but I give it a fantasy flair where, they're going on a quest. They have a magic system of sorts in it. And, I just it has like a Alice in Wonderland kind of quality where I didn't really have in mind what the system would work like, but you know, you
Mm.
have miracles of sorts, but it's really just, data and malware and that sort. But in more serious works, I have written this story I called Barnacles, Moss, and Rust, which would be featured in Lovecraftiana this summer. There's, fish or sea creature zombies. Um, the nature how they came to be, I don't quite go too deep into it, but they bring a supernatural quality into this industrial, very futuristic setting. That's apocalyptic, almost left behind, like a very lofty, ambitious uh, construction that humanity made, and it might lean into why the maybe the sea is fighting back against it. But I want to say too much about that.
As you mentioned before, right? Genres are almost often subcategorized or mixed with another to build a new one completely. And if we zoom out a little bit, are there recognizable subgenre within the futuristic fantasy? Because right now, I think as I'm watching the trends of the publishing industry, I'm seeing a lot more science fantasy, right? That's the new term that we have not. Space fantasy is always a topic of conversations, or post-apocalyptic fantasy. What are some of the subgenres that you particularly favor, or do you like to tap in more, especially when it comes to futuristic fantasy?
Feel like it's an umbrella. My
Mhm.
futurist fantasy is not something you're, Googling and finding but it does feel like within this umbrella idea, there are categories coming from different directions. So, my sci fantasy for sure, hope punk, transporting a past culture to the future. Accelerationist fiction, like what's the logical conclusion of it, which is an outgrowth of alt history. And alt history can go into the future, and despite, let's say, the past 30 so years of it being a very right wing thing, originally alt history, alt history was a very left wing thing of looking for utopias. It's an alternative future without a whitewash. And another subcategory I would put in there as well is a mystical future.
Can you elaborate on the mystical future?
Mystical future, is there a ghost in the shell kind of thing? Echopraxia by Peter Watts, a great example of that, where and I think Blind Sight is another novel of his where some of it is explained, some of it is hard science fiction. It fits into what you would expect science fiction to be, but then there's a vampire on the ship and he plays a very pivotal role in the plot. It is somewhat explained that, vampires came up on Earth at some previous time, and this guy is a member of the crew. But that mystical thing being brought into science fiction elements, you can have, urban fantasy elements, let's say, in science fiction.
Because it's such a like sort of niche right now. I feel like
Yes.
I feel like talking about like science fantasy and like the punk genre sort of covers what I'm personally aware of in terms of like futuristic fantasy, because other than because when you start to get out of that, I believe you're just starting to describe like, oh, maybe this is urban fantasy, which is already more
Mm,
established, and like while it does have some overlap with futuristic fantasy, it's very much its own thing because it's from the perspective of like a medieval fantasy character. It is futuristic and there is fantasy in this urban fantasy, but it's not futuristic fantasy per se. It's something different. It's um I guess you could also think of a lot of D&D slash TTRPG inspired settings as futuristic fantasy, like I believe Spelljammer, even just like plain old D&D itself with the classes like Artificer, where it's like this is a fantasy, I believe fantasy technician, I think is what the class is. So it's very much like less that there are less defined subgenres within futuristic fantasy, and it's more like
mm,
a umbrella thing where a lot of things fall under it that also fall under other more established genres.
Mostly steampunk in a way, or
mm,
gaslight fantasy, you could say.
mm-hmm,
Um, since I if it merges the two really well, since you have a older time that works well with a fantasy aesthetic, or it's the age of exploration still. There's still things to be discovered. You could mix that in with a more futuristic sense too. I don't know what you would call this subgenre because it definitely exists, but there's not a name put to it. But stories like Dune and um, was it Adrian Truskowski's work? I think Elder Race.
Children of Time, you mean?
Yeah, but there's this novellas called Elder Race, um,
Oh.
where it's like very, very far future, and it's portrayed sort of like fantasy, but it's just humans in the far future, um, which kind of felt like Dune to me. But that's a trend I see sometimes where it may be so far future, humans are just messing around with technology that's really old, but they look at it as magic sometimes. That's not exactly Dune, but they're they're so far future they treat, like psychic abilities as if we're magic, and they call those who have those abilities witches sometimes. But my favorite subgenre would probably be with steampunk, of how to merge the futurism and fantasy, pretty much like how Arcane did it.
Bouncing off on of this, do you then think that these labels really matter, or are they more marketing than storytelling?
I think they matter, mostly because it is easier with marketing to have that type of label so people can find you easier. But I also just think that having a bunch of people doing a subgenre and like building a community of just all it's a little group of this is our subgenre, this is what we do kind of a thing. It gets people to be able to explore more. And I feel
Mm,
like I've never been able to like really say that labels don't matter. I think that labels really do matter when finding community and things like that. And I think that the more people write and this and like learn about futurism fantasy and learn it's like a concept that they could explore, and more people ended up writing all these stories, I think there's going to be more subgenres later that it could branch out and expand. But like as Yuan was saying, right now it feels like it is like under like an umbrella term. But I think later on it's not going to be an umbrella term anymore. I think it could come out.
I guess I market more with the vibe than the specific genre. Like I
mm,
just call my work what is it? Noble dark fantasy, which is like grim dark, but a little bit more hope in there. Where it's not,
mm,
you the characters go through so much trials that with enough trials they can achieve something and eventually change the world for the better. It's just really, really hard. But I in general go with retrofuturism and noble dark fantasy to describe most of my stories.
Not that necessarily that genre is fake. That's just my like tagline to like be incendiary, but like genre is very much fluid, so fluid in the sense that like the terms that like the granular terms that we have like uh the urban fantasy, futuristic fantasy, space fantasy, science fantasy, space opera, like those are very much the way we conceptualize them now, more marketing terms than concrete ideas. Because when you look at older works of speculative fiction, the genre boundaries were a lot less defined, a lot more like transparent than they are in certain cases nowadays. Um, in terms of what Rob, like as Robin said, in terms of building community, those categories are definitely very useful, especially even to readers when they're looking for works that will appeal to them. Like a reader might be more interested in lit RPG than they are necessarily in isekai because there is to them a very clear difference that they're searching for. But as a writer, um, I believe like genre, like those genre categories are like a lot less defined and matter a lot less because we're trying to write a story more than we're trying to write a specific genre. We're not necessarily as focused on what is necessarily trying to like we're not necessarily as focused on trying to hit certain what are they called, like targets, as we are trying to like
yeah.
tell a good story. And if it happens to fall on the line between science fiction and fantasy, and it goes under that futuristic fantasy umbrella, all the better. And then it does help our marketing teams like market the stories better. But it's not something I feel like we should concern ourselves with as much when we're writing.
Kind of like a nickname. Like you can, come up with a nickname, call it yourself. Lots of rappers do that and then build themselves up based on that name. You want to create a subcategory that nobody else is writing in or that you believe exists and you can draw the lines between them. Cool, awesome. It might turn into something. Lit RPG is a great example of that, where the genre didn't exist. People were writing similar things, and in a very indie way, it kind of started to coalesce, but it was totally outside of publishing. It was only in indie. People were insular with their culture about it, but did very well at bringing it together and meeting others who were doing similar things. And then you have the opposite as well of people are starting to do this. It's a groundswell of things. And then someone from the outside comes in and says, oh, I know what y'all are doing and the relation between them, and that's like that's where you get things like hope punk, where the subcategory is created because people are writing this story, and someone might say they're writing science fiction, someone might say they're writing fantasy, someone might say they're writing climate fiction, and they're like, well, let's just put you all guys in a manageable box because of what we see from the outside.
Great. I love it that we talk about we talk a little bit away from the genre and more on storytelling and writing craft. And since we're coming closer to the last few questions, I also wanted to again bring it back to you guys and your own work and how you have combined futurism and fantasy in your stories, but also how you approach storytelling or writing your story. And so maybe here's some helpful conversation starters. When you start writing, what do you think comes first, right? Like the world or the magic or the technology?
For me, it always starts with a song. Um, that always manages to paint the world and characters in my mind
Mm.
in an instant. I almost consider it a problem because I can listen to a good song and I'll get another idea, and it's like another world I have to put on the list. But
Oh, I love that.
sometimes it's usually the world first, or really an idea, an aesthetic, a theme where it starts high concept and then it trickles down where I discover who really fits in there. But I always think of what kind of shots I would like, what kind of um what kind of situations do I want to see the characters in before I even know who I'm really writing. Or then I think of what kind of characters do I really want to see in this world and how can I make it different? How intense do I want it to be? And just listening to a song, giving me that soundtrack, uh, does a lot for me.
I was gonna say the core story of it usually happens to me at first. Like,
Mm.
I think I had for my current work in progress, I had more of like Logan's story overall. And then as I kind of sat there, I just slowly built out the world and then built out the technology. So I did technology last technically, but
Ah.
it was kind of interesting just to see what technology later on that I
Mhm.
felt existed within the world. And I basically been writing out like a little list of just weird things that I was thinking about, like how not only like solar farms, but have like solar buses and solar cars and having the lights outside, you know how they're always at one level. Just sometimes they go lighter if no people are around to conserve energy. Um, just different smaller things like that that I've been just kind of exploring every scene and being like, is there a way I could just like subtly hint at this as I go throughout the scene and bring that in? But I think the plot it comes to me first, and that's the one
Mm.
that like really brings into it. And my fantasy elements always usually combine with the plot, so they come in a little after that. So I have magical powers within my world, and then that dives into the solar punk.
I love world building. Absolutely. I definitely have some short stories out there that would fit into this. I Future Floods of Houston was nominated for a Penn Dow Award, and that was in Defunct magazine. Just we had a series of floods here in Houston that happened to coincide with holidays. So there was the Tax Day flood, the Memorial Day flood, and I was like, well, what if there was the Iguana Day flood? What if there was the Great August Flood, because it has no holidays, for the entire month? Um, and just kind of extrapolating forward, if these disasters keep happening, what happens in the future? Another example as well is a story I wrote that was in Punt Velat, my literary magazine out of Barcelona. And it was a series of CIA letters written about how they're very upset that fentanyl is on the streets. We really need to make a new drug and put it out there like we did back in the day. And since I wrote that and got it out there, sometimes when I read headlines, I'm like, oh no, what did I cast into the future?
How would you approach this genre? Oh,
Um, the the elements of it that appeal to me are less, let's say, the mystical, but very much the idea of taking past conflicts, taking past stories of people's lives, and then casting them into the future. So if there was, you know, the partition of Ireland, the fight between different groups for civil rights in the 60s and 70s. What does that look if it's in South Texas in 2040? This way of looking at how people's lives happened, and then using that to transpose into the future what could happen, might happen, based on the past. We're back at Jade City again as well.
Actually, for the most part, I do begin a lot like Robin, like with the plot and then moving into the world. But for me, it's sort of a very quick through line of the plot that I build off of for a little bit, and then I move into the world because in a lot of my stories, the world is like very important to like actually helping me decide where the plot is going to go, because I will know this is going to be a story about revenge and this person is trying to kill this other person for doing XYZ, but I don't know necessarily all the nitty-gritty like aspects of, okay, why do they need revenge necessarily on this person, what about this person, like I don't know, like every other typical writer. And then from there I spend like a lot of time because I love world building on the world. And I don't necessarily even go into a story thinking it will be a knowing necessarily if it will be like science fiction or fantasy
mm,
or what the genre is, but as I start building the world, I do find myself gathering elements from all the genres. Like this is taking, for example, this project I mentioned earlier, the Sandalpunk one. It began wholly as a um, more historical inspired world with elements of fantasy in it. But then I realized I don't necessarily want to set it in like a real world place, so I moved into making it a fantasy story. And then I was like, okay, but and then I was very at the time I was very kill 6 billion demons, which is actually another futuristic fantasy story. I was very kill 6 billion demons and Gideon the Ninth pilled. So I was like, okay, but what if it's set in space? And I was like, okay, just putting all these things into the story. And that's generally how my story writing process goes. Like we have the bit of the plot, we have some of the characters, and then we move into the world. And the world takes up a lot of my bandwidth because I'm like so inspired by so many things all the time, and then I'm making the world. I'm like, oh, okay, this is such a cool idea. What if I put this in the world, and that's why this character does XYZ, and that sometimes ends up changing the plot a little bit. Other times it ends up changing the plot drastically, especially when it comes to the ending, because um, I want my plots to affect the world in like very drastic ways. So I try to build worlds that are ripe for change in that way, which I feel um, writing futuristic fantasy stories like works really well with that because um, a lot of ideas inherent to like science fiction and futurism is the idea of change, and that's something I really want to embody a lot in a lot of my stories.
and when you start the world building itself, what kind of challenges do you often run into?
I definitely think it's important to, when you're dealing with cultural relativism and living in a city like Houston, 215 cultures, people speaking 10 to 12 different languages that I meet in a single day, to move forward and look both at doing your research, being mindful of other people's cultures and sensitivity readers. So this idea of a futurist fantasy and wanting it to be a pluralistic future that we're going to live in, I try to definitely, use sensitivity readers or speak with people to make sure that I can hit the right cultural relativism without taking more than is my own.
It can come down to like really minor details. Hard to come up with something off the top of my head, but I guess deciding on what I want the what a
Mm.
world to look like, getting down to the minor details, or maybe deciding on which direction I'd want it to go, with a character. Like would it be better for them to do this or that, and to take the story in what direction, and that can affect
That makes sense.
how the world
Mm.
evolves from there.
Interesting. That's very interesting. What I tend to struggle with, I guess, is after I create world building, like I create this gigantic world, and maybe it's just me, but I really tend to go overboard. I like to create something huge, but when it comes to storytelling itself, it has to be about the characters, right? Maybe what's one thing that you would like to give out to writers or readers? Where do you think that they're often overlooked when blending futurism and fantasy?
I just want to tell, like, I want people to like not be so afraid to like put the thing in their work. Like, you might be worried, like if you're not writing historical fiction or very strictly historically aligned fantasy or anything like that, I want people to like not be worried about whether or not something will fit or suspend people's disbelief because like at the end of the day, we are writing speculative fiction and readers of speculative fiction can suspend their disbelief for a lot of things. So you're okay putting that like train in your story. You're okay putting those as Robin said, like those lights in your story that change depending on when people are there. Like it you can explain it away if you want, or you cannot explain it away if you want. And at the end of the day, it'll be like um it'll add to like the fantasy, it'll add to the magic of the story. Um, and as a writer, I think we should be like more focused on like if these things will serve the story and the world rather than if it will like necessarily like not make sense. Make sense is the wrong way to put it, but like if it will like be like scientifically accurate for a world like this. Like, oh, I'm worried that my mountains are like this. Okay, but like consider what if fantasy.
I love that. Don't be afraid
Hmm.
to be more outrageous when it
Yes.
comes to your work building.
I feel like a lot of writers put themselves into boxes where they have to, like, I have to hit a certain word count um for every chapter, and that's how it's a chapter. I have to hit like a certain thing, and they want to. I feel like they're very inspired by people who've done it before, and they just want to hit all the same marks that others have done. But I think with fantasy and sci-fi is and futurism in general is just you got to explore anything. You can't just let boundaries stop you. Just because somebody stopped here at this line before doesn't mean you need to stop there at that line. Just to keep going and do as much as you can explore. Like just don't limit yourself to what you're writing. Just let the world come out.
You really gotta be fall in love with what you're writing. Like
Mhm.
don't write something where you think a lot of people are gonna love. And I know the saying, there's nothing new under the sun, but always try to challenge that anyway. And
I
don't
love that.
don't be and don't be discouraged if there's an idea similar to yours, but there's always, if you're daring to be weird enough, then you can create something that no one has seen, and only so many stories get published out there. So you do have the chance to be the first to be known.
Oh, I love that. Do not be afraid to be weird enough. I love that. I think that can be something that we take
Yes.
away from this panel.
that's important, being weird enough.
Hmm.
I suppose you know, really fantasy lovers will be afraid to pick apart the science of some mythological characters or getting down into the how it will be industrialized, but also finding a balance of still making it feel magical in a sense, because you would have people who will want to protect the whimsy, but you'll also have people who want to exploit it for business and such. And you can find so much cool story ideas when you explore how people would exploit it in that way. So yeah, I would say not to be afraid to um, deconstruct fantasy like that. And you can still make it feel like the fantasy story you want, but it'll just feel really different. Just like how Arcane did it. They corporatized, they industrialized magic, but it was still a fantasy story.
I want to tell writers to go down those Wikipedia rabbit holes. To learn and find inspiration in weird little bits of history and cultures and myths from all over the world. I definitely want people to create the future that they want to see, and to look far beyond the medieval. If you're working in fantasy, even our idea of what medieval was is completely incorrect. It's very interesting that you can have fantasy novels, and especially 60s, 70s, 80s, where it's like, oh, the empire had existed for 6,000 years. Bruh, nobody's empire exists that long. Technology had been stuck at the same level for 500 years. That's not what happens. That's not humans. Things are always changing. And this goes to Arcane again, where you can look at your world and think, what would it be one generation above and behind, and place yourself in that quirky time that you want it to be, but accept that things are always changing.
Thank you so much to our panelists and for being here. Please let us know where we can find you online or in person and what we can expect from you in the future.
I'm not necessarily on social media or very active on social media, but I do have an Instagram, a Blue Sky. But you can find me online at nebulouswrites.com. If you want to email me, I love emailing. I love digital snail mail. As I said earlier, my debut novel, Blackest Diamond, was released earlier this year in March. But I also write short stories, and I'm getting into games writing. So looking forward to that in the future.
You can definitely find me online on my tomeworksedits.com, as well as our YouTube channel where we put on Writer's Lunch every Thursday at 1 p.m. That's under Tomeworks on YouTube. Other than that, catch me in Houston. We at Houston Writing Central run write-ins every Wednesday from 6 to 8 p.m. at Melange Creperie in the Heights. And I'm around. Hopefully see you at a con, or absolutely.
You can find me on Blue Sky and Tumblr at Dragon Editing. I do dragon editing services for fantasy and sci-fi writers. I also run a giveaway for query letters. If anyone wants a free query letter edit, I do once a month for disabled and queer writers. You can just sign up for there. I don't have any published books actually, but I am working on it. I think I really want to do it before my 30th birthday, so I really hope so. So soon.
You can find me at replicant.card.co. All my links are there. I mostly post on Blue Sky, but I'm on Twitter too. I sometimes post video essays about genres on my YouTube channel, also Replicant. And and yeah, look forward to me in Lovecraftiana and fantasy story about a witch who takes pictures in Witches Save the World. That'll be coming soon.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists and to all of the audience who are here today. Thank you for being here and enjoy the rest of the event.